It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. We're at episode 95, but the reality is we've been around a lot longer in the podcast world. But these episodes 1 to 95 take us through all matters Australian and then go overseas. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate. How are you?
I'm excellent.
How are things in Hong Kong today? Did you survive the Cat, whatever it was, Cat 5 last week?
We got to a T8, I think, which is unusual but not unprecedented this time of the year. We had another T1 while it was cold and wet and miserable, actually, but the weather has turned here, and that means our weather pattern is by and large coming off the inland of China. And when that happens, you can still get a T8 because still get a typhoon because that happens because of the hot water in the hot ocean down in the South China Sea. But you can also have the cold weather coming from northern China.
Big storms on the Pacific Northwest of the United States, Jack. I think one dead is the body count at the moment with storms there, and I think over 1 million households without power in the Northern California area.
I did get off to a good start this morning by reading your piece on Peter Fitzsimons in the in the Australian.
I've had quite a few comments about that today. Look, when you say T8, when I think of T8, that means the railway line from Campbelltown to Sydney via the airport. But unless some stopgap measure, some intervention from the government occurs, New South Wales Rail will be off on strike all day tomorrow. We're recording on the 21st of the 11th. That will be Friday the 22nd. And that promises to be a very chaotic day, Jack. And this is probably Chris Minns' first test, I would think. Just because there's really no one else to blame but he and his Transport Secretary.
Why is that, do you think?
Minister. Sorry? Well, look, this has been going on for a long time. The former Transport Minister, former National Party member, I'm just trying to think of his name, he said he never had a strike on his watch when he was Transport Minister for about 10 years because you're engaged in conversations with the union on a regular basis. And he claimed that sort of thing has not been going on nearly well enough. So it's a bit of a challenge, and it will be a very chaotic day in Sydney tomorrow. Thank God I'll be in the national capital, where things will be just as we thought. I'm hooking up with Mike Bowers, and Mike got a write-up in the Herald today. He has left The Guardian. And I saw some rather odd remarks from the editor-in-chief there, that it was, who said Lenore Taylor, who claimed that it was Mike's decision to leave. But my understanding is The Guardian does not need says it does not need a photographer in the national capital anymore. No one, they're going to hawk them all off Associated Press instead. Sad news. Mike is a terrific bloke, so I hope he's going to be okay.
Guardian don't like paying much, do they?
They do not practice what they preach, mate. I think we can safely say that. All right, the other rather disturbing matter in Sydney is that a number of cars were vandalised last night in the eastern suburbs, sort of between Bondi and Rose Bay. According to the SMH, when police arrived, they discovered a dozen cars on Wellington, Ocean, Tara and Fullerton streets had been vandalised with spray paint. Multiple cars parked outside Chiswick had been targeted. Nine reported that the restaurant was also vandalised with white graffiti sprayed on his windows. Some cars had graffiti reading FUCK, Israel, and others said PKK is coming. And that's not Paul Keating. That is the Kurdish separatist group known as the Korean. Not Korean. Known as the Kurdish Workers' Party, Jack. It's an odd form of graffiti, I would have thought, in eastern Sydney.
Yeah, Wellington Ocean, Tara, and Fullerton is the middle of Wallara, in the consular belt of Wallara.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, I was going down a bit further. Consular district.
And Chiswick is the Matt Moran restaurant in the garden in Chiswick Gardens.
That's right.
There.
I think Moran's
very
vehicle
good.
was damaged as well. Also, Jack, odd sort of graffiti, what we might call fairly trivial, or arcane might be a better word. The reference to the Kurdish Workers' Party. Very strange.
Yeah, it does seem a bit odd.
Police are investigating. Meanwhile, in Melbourne, we've got some news here. We don't often get into the day-to-day stuff, but in and around the country. But in Melbourne, Chapel Street, Paran, one of the major shopping districts of the city, has been closed while basically due to what is considered to be an arson attack on a South Yarra nightclub, Jack. It's the Lux nightclub, and about 50 firefighters and 15 trucks spent nearly 2 hours fighting the blaze. The owners of the Lux nightclub, I believe, are also the owners of the Love Machine, Jack. A Love Machine might sound like an adult theatre, but it isn't. It's a nightclub, and there have been shootings and indeed a murder outside that club as well. So if we put two and two together, we don't want to get ahead of the police investigation too much. This would be, I would think, part of an extortion racket against the owners of the club.
It can be a high-risk business, the late-night businesses.
Yes, indeed. And the theory goes, well, it's not the theory, but the actual practicality of it goes, you run the door in a nightclub, you run everything that goes on inside and outside that club, in the immediate vicinity, and that means you're obviously running the drug supply or overseeing it, and that can lead to a great deal of tension amongst some of our warring criminal groups, Jack.
The other great place for this, I discovered, were the two brothers who used to clip my hair in Fitzroy back in the day. And they did very, very well. They were doing way too well, I thought, for the amount of heads of hair they were cutting each week.
Hello.
But as it turns out, people, if they're going out for a big night, they go to the hairdresser on the way. And what else do you pick up when you get there?
Oh, I see, Jack. Yes. Did they ever come a cropper, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, one of them had a holiday, yes.
One of them had a holiday shortly afterwards.
Lovely fellows, I've got to tell you. But yeah.
You might be at a little bit of a disadvantage. I just came across this from Greg Jericho, who's a mate. He writes for The Guardian, and he's also an economist with the Australian Institute. He wrote a piece today.
That's why he can afford to write for The Guardian without getting paid, presumably.
Yeah, I could tell you some stories. But anyway, I won't. I don't want to put him at odds. Greg's piece are littered with graphs. We sometimes mock him a bit about it, but he loves a graph. And there are some very good graphs there. But he's basically showing that living standards now are at 2015 levels. So we've sort of gone back about 10 years in living standards across the country. There's been slower state growth across the board in this year than the previous one. Western Australia had a shocker of a year because its exports were disrupted by weather, Jack. The ABS noted that there was less production of oil and gas due to weather disruptors. Bit of a climate change thing there. But the main thrust of Greg's piece is about the RBA and how they basically administer what he calls poison, or pain upon Australians generally. And I just want to read this, Jack, 'cause I think it was really good. And so the medicine of interest rates, the RBA argues, is for our own good. We need to stop spending so much. The economy will be back in balance. Unfortunately for everyone, they got the diagnosis wrong. That's the Reserve Bank. And the medicine they are inflicting is a poison. In the decade prior to the pandemic, the RBA cut rates in a desperate attempt to keep household spending. It was a decade of historically poor household spending, a decade where the recovery from the GFC was stunted by austerity measures of the Abbott hockey years. By 2019, things were extremely dire, as even with rate cuts, spending fell below the decade trend level. Then the pandemic came, and the RBA cut rates again to keep things somewhat alive. But since then, it has all been about interest rate rises. And sure, maybe as things opened up and we all went shopping again, you could understand the RBA being worried that we were all a bit too excited. But even as our spending slowed and then fell, the RBA kept administering the poison. Jack, this is really... The RBA has only one weapon, and it is a blunt weapon, isn't it? And basically, what you're saying is, oh well, we're going to have to have a little bit of pain, but that pain is really felt most genuinely by those in the middle classes and the working classes, those with mortgages, and often just new home buyers as well, and they've had to wear, a very sharp tightening of the belt, and really around some very, very poor timing. So the RBA should have gone, cut rates a bit earlier than the pandemic. We might forgive them for not knowing that the pandemic was going to come to us, but then they really just were very slow with monetary policy as the pandemic effects started to drop off.
To be fair to the RBA, this disproportionate effect is happening around the world. That other central banks are getting this pretty much the same, wrong to pretty much the same, to the same degree. We're living in interesting times. I saw yesterday.
That's a Chinese proverb, Jack.
Yeah, Jim Chalmers keen to pull the future fund back. Seem to be keen to pull the future fund back into his orbit a bit by directing how it should spend the money, and he's also sort of wanting to have a little bit more say in the Reserve Bank. It's going to be interesting to watch how this plays out, I think.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think the points that he's making, and certainly Dennis Shanahan, Judith Sloan, and Eric Johnson, as well as my very good friend Tom Dusevich, are talking about that now. The Chalmers is a reformer. I reckon he's the only one keeping the government going, to be honest. And that doesn't mean that he's always going to be popular with conservatives.
Or that he's always going to be right.
It's my job to improve, not to preserve the $230 billion future fund. So he is going to some degree, direct its spending, Jack, or direct its investments.
Yeah, I'm always suspicious of that because I he seems a smart fella, Jim Chalmers, but I don't think he knows better than the market. Is my response to that?
I think that's a bit of an issue too. So it depends very much if it falls into what we might call boutique spending, boutique investments. That may not stand up overall, but $230 billion, you really can't go wrong with a lot of that. You could just plonk it in the short-term market, mate, make some decent cash.
You could. I just think that the government's got to be a little bit careful. It wants to remind itself, for those of them who are old enough, to remind themselves that they want to be more like the Hawke government and less like the Whitlam government.
Yeah, look, I take your point, but really, I'm finding that this is not a government. This is not a reforming government. It's nothing like Whitlam and nothing like Hawke either. This is not a reforming government. This is a reactive government. And I would think the only exception to that is really Chalmers. We did talk about the MAD bill, the misinfo and disinfo bill last week, Jack. Someone's got a flea in their ear about that, and they want to keep pursuing it. And the thought occurred to me, just to follow up on what we discussed last week, that maybe the government is driving this to die. Otherwise, I can make no sense of it.
No, it looks from this distance to be a bit clueless about all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, combined with the social media prohibitions on teenagers up to the age of 16, which they think is a winner. The opposition obviously thinks it's a winner because they're going to support the bill. But I think combined with the MAD bill, it'll just reek of government overreach. Whether that's the case or not, that will be the community perception. So drop it, you fools.
And
Elbo's been...
not just that, it won't work either.
Oh, well, it wouldn't be the first lot of legislation didn't work. Had some unforeseen circumstances, but look, this is politically disastrous, and the black letter of the bill is pretty awful too. But this is just not a fight you want to have in an election year or coming towards an election. I think the last one we can have, a last date we can have is September, I think 24th next year.
Yeah, and it'll be earlier than that, probably around April.
Yeah, it'll be. They won't do it in the footy finals.
Yeah, no, it'll probably be April. You're more in contact with what's happening in Canberra. In fact, you're going there tomorrow. Is there something missing in the Prime Minister's office or in the backroom staff up there? There just seems to be a lack of steady hands.
I don't know. I don't know certainly, and I've spoken to a couple of people who work in his office. I suspect there's too many of them, Jack.
The numbers are outrageous these days.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you forget about cricket teams. You've got a couple of AFL footy teams sitting there. I think his media advisors amount to a cricket team, or near enough. And all that can possibly do is just add to confusion. Confuse messaging.
It can. They need to wander down the hill to the old Parliament House and see how big the Prime Minister's office was in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, well, they just don't go leaner and meaner, but essentially that's what you want, and there should be one major driver of all communications coming from the Prime Minister's office, and I suspect there are more than one at the moment. So, yes. He needs to get that right, and it's clear to me that it's not right at the moment. But there he was on the international stage this week, probably breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief that he could mingle with the world's leaders at the G20. It took marathon negotiations over the weekend for diplomats to finalise the joint statement, with debate over climate policy stretching into the dawn hours of Sunday, according to people involved in the talks. In their statement, leaders agreed the world needs to reach a deal by the end of the United Nations COP29 Climate Change Summit in Azerbaijan. We'll talk about that a bit later too. Putin was absent, of course, so he's got warrants for his arrest out there. I'm bugging if I know why Sergei Lavrov keeps turning up too, Jack. I would imagine there should be some warrants for his arrest as well. Comments from the Germans, Jack. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said, "We are experiencing a major change in global structures." The elephant in the room did not get a mention at all, and that is the election of Donald Trump. No, Schultz noted the growing weight of major developing economies. These are countries that want to have their say, and they will no longer accept that everything will continue to be the way it has been for decades. These are, as you say, interesting times, Jack. Chinese President Xi Jinping took the occasion to announce a raft of measures designed to support the developing economies of the global south, from scientific cooperation with Brazil and African nations to lowering trade barriers for least developed countries. From an Australian perspective, Jack, the Prime Minister had a relatively short media conference where, among other comments, he said, "We all reiterated our resolve to work towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and to increase renewable energy capacity globally. It is notable too that all members of the G20 were able to agree to language on geopolitical issues, including the conflict in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine, which is having a global economic impact as well. We recommitted to advancing the goal of a world full of nuclear weapons." That gives rise to some issues that came about from COP29, which we will deal with shortly, Jack. But I guess any day that Anthony Albanese is rubbing shoulders with the powerful is probably a good day.
When you're Prime Minister, it nearly always is a good day.
Yeah.
Unless you pratfall down some stairs or something, it's a good day.
All right, sticking with our local news or Australian news, Alan Jones was arrested on Monday morning, very early, knock on the door, Jack. 9 alleged victims now. There were originally 8 when he was first charged. There have been more charges, 2 more charges with another victim coming forward. And New South Wales Police Commissioner Karen Webb says there may be more. We won't add to any comment on, we don't certainly want to comment about this, other than to say the charges as they stand can be heard in a magistrate's court, Jack, but they may in fact be heard in a district court in front of a jury. We don't know yet.
Yeah, it could be.
Other than Alan Jones has indicated through his lawyers that he's going to plead not guilty.
This should all play out in the way it's meant to. One thing I don't feel quite comfortable with is the way the police and the media and their media unit handled this. I don't like perp walks and I don't like police calling for anyone else to come forward. They're supposed to investigate a crime, not a person.
I won't editorialise on that other than to say everything I've been told by people on the ground around this story assure me that the police did tip off the media that they were headed to Jones' house on Monday morning. And it was a pretty awful scrum outside Day Street Police Station in Sydney with Alan Jones and his lawyer Chris Murphy.
Well, that was the shock to me. I used to see
two old blokes, and they were just absolutely surrounded. It just looked awful. And that's not to be. I'm not talking about any particular sympathy for an alleged perpetrator. I'm just talking about just an ugly scene.
And you, like me, would have seen Chris Murphy around and about the eastern suburbs of Sydney.
I know Chris pretty well. Yeah, reasonably well.
Yeah, I'm at least on nodding acquaintance with him. I had to look 3 times to see whether it was him. He looks terribly old all of a sudden.
Look terribly old. You want to be very careful what you say there, Jack, because the Sunday Telegraph or Daily Telegraph columnist, gossip columnist, Annette Sharp, suggested in a column, or wrote in a column, that Chris was past his days of appearing in court. That he had been unwell and didn't attend court anymore and this sort of stuff. And he sued and won.
Well, we wouldn't be suggesting he's past it. He just looked a bit old.
Yeah. But just be a bit careful with that. He certainly won. And when I looked at this, I actually don't remember it occurring at the time. But the action, but it went to court and he did win. And of course, what Annette Sharp was saying was that his kind of legal practice, or his ability to lead his own legal practice, was perhaps diminished by his age and illness.
Yeah, I haven't seen any evidence of that, but it was kind of sad to see him looking quite as old as he did.
He's 75, mate. And I believe his health hasn't been great, but there he was on the front line for Alan Jones at the police station there. We'll move on, Jack. 2 senators censured by the Senate, by their colleagues in the Senate. Lydia Thorpe for her performative outrage in the Great Hall of Parliament when Prince Charles was there. That we remember so well.
King Charles.
Did I say Prince? Yeah, that's just a bad
Yes.
thing. Yes, of course, King Charles. King Charles III. And so she was censured on the numbers. It didn't go to a vote. It was on the voices, I should say, as was Ralph Babbitt, the UAP senator, for a fairly awful ex-post that he'd made that used unfortunate language, Jack. And he too was censored. He wasn't there, and I believe his attendance in the Senate is something of an issue. But he was trying to get a flight from Melbourne to Canberra at the time he was censured. My question about this is, how come we know all about Lydia Thorpe's censure? We don't know anything about Ralph Babbitt. Ralph Babbitt's censure. It happened almost simultaneously, and the only headlines we got and reports we got were about Lydia Thorpe.
Until you pointed out to me, I didn't know a thing about the Babbitt censorship, and I watched the Melbourne and Sydney papers pretty closely, and it completely passed me by.
They just maybe this is a theory, Jack, that maybe Ralph Babbitt is such a non-entity that our news editors are saying, well, let's not waste any ink on this guy.
Yeah, it could be. Speaking of that end of the political spectrum, I suppose. Did you see Clive Palmer on the telly on the ABC the other night doing an interview?
Well, he was threatening to sue over the, I guess, political donations bill, for want of a better term.
Yeah, I think he might be on the big O. He's lost about a third of his body weight, I've got to say, and perhaps that's improved his brain power, because it was easily the best performance by Clive Palmer I've ever seen.
Yeah, look, I think when it comes to Babbitt, my favourite story about him, he lists his mobile phone number, which is also the contact number for his real estate agency in southeastern Melbourne. And he got a call from one of my colleagues, the Australian, about that, and he confirmed that, and he sort of struggled his way through it. It was actually the day that Queen Elizabeth II died, and he offered my colleague, he said, well, I've just written a little something about Queen Elizabeth. I was wondering if you want me to give it to you. And my colleague declined. No point in having that anywhere there. It was a lovely little backhander too, by the way. All right, so we did mention COP29. I wrote a piece about it last week. It's been run by a gangster. It's been run in a gangster regime, basically, which is just awful. But the point here, the sort of headline that was made, is that the US and UK had basically, they'd signed to update their nuclear agreements. This is just trying to think of the name of it. It's called the Generation 4 Forum. It was set up in 2001 to produce designs for fourth-generation nuclear reactors and eventually replace the Gen 3 designs currently running in many countries. And the US and UK expectation was that Australia would sign on to it, and that included a specific mention from Ed Miliband, indicating that Australia would likely sign on. But Australia did not sign on because that would have caused all manner of problems with the opposition's wielding their nuclear policy, Jack.
This is all very amusing, I thought. You got to wonder at at the sort of backroom work that the US and UK diplomats were doing, that they didn't know that that would be a problem for Australia, that they just presumed Australia would sign up? I mean, it's a diplomat's job, or it's the backroom people's job, to be able to say, no, Australia won't do that because they're in the middle of a political battle over whether nuclear should be part of the mix or not.
You would imagine that Bowen has spoken to Miliband prior to attending COP29 in Baku and said, listen, mate, don't name us in any in any missives you should be handing out because this is why. But that appears not to have been the case. I just wanted to give us a little bit of a background into nuclear energy, Jack. As it stands, well, at least in 2023, about 9% of the world's electricity came from the roughly 400 nuclear reactors producing power. In recent years, nuclear growth, this is from The Conversation, by the way, in recent years, nuclear growth has been concentrated in Asia, especially China, which has 30 reactors under construction, followed by Russia and Eastern Europe. Tripling the world's nuclear power output is the aim, but it's going to be very, very difficult to get to that point. And look, there has been a burst of enthusiasm for the small modular reactors, Jack. And the ones driving that are not countries necessarily, but they're big tech giants. Because as we know, AI is highly demanding, and data storage requires a great deal of power. So Amazon, Google, and Microsoft have announced plans for deliveries of SMRs in the early 2030s.
And the recommissioning of the famous 3 Mile Island plant as well.
Yeah, that happened. Yeah, that happened this week. Those corporate SMRs will have a proposed capacity of 1 gigawatt or less. The government spokesman, after the Miliband imbroglio with the statement, said, as Australia does not have a nuclear energy industry and nuclear power is illegal domestically, we will not be signing up to this agreement, which is pretty straightforward. I mean, essentially, if they did sign up to that agreement, Jack, they would have to legislate prior to that to allow it.
Yes. Personally, I think that this is the John Howard law that makes nuclear power illegal in Australia. Personally, I think that should be repealed.
I know you've got a personal view about that, but the fact is that it isn't and not likely to be before the next election. So that sort of should have told Miliband and Bowen, advising Miliband, just what Australia's position is. Europe now, Jack, and I presume this came, you put some reference in here, I presume this came from an extended X or tweet or Twitter tweet?
It did.
Okay, I'll just read. Do you want to read it out, please?
This is from Ole Lemon, I think, is a German commentator. I'm German. 18 years ago, the EU and the US economies were neck and neck. Today, the US economy is 50% larger than the entire EU combined. Here's the devastating truth behind what he calls Europe's ongoing economic suicide. First, look at the numbers. US GDP, 25.5 trillion, EU GDP, 16.5 trillion. But in 2008, they were 14 and 14 respectively. And he's
14.8 for the US and 14.2
which is a rounding error difference.
Yeah. Well, it's hundreds of millions. It's hundreds of billions. Go on, but go on.
His theory is that the Europeans chose security over growth, and that America chose innovation over regulation. And the result is that America's produced a lot of $9 trillion companies, and 9 out of the 10 of the most valuable companies in the world are American, and there's nothing from Europe in that group. It's an interesting theory, but the numbers are pretty stark.
You can't just... I think he's, broadly speaking, not too far away. But look, you obviously have to take. So firstly, his figures are right. So that 14.8 and 14.2 in 2008, 14.8 trillion was the US GDP, 14.2 trillion in the EU in 2008. And they are now, this is all US dollars, by the way, folks, 25.5 trillion, likely to be 29. It's forecast to be 29 trillion at the end of next year, Jack. And the EU is currently at 16, just on 17 trillion. He was a little bit out there with that. But of course, you've got to. Is almost 4 trillion that you've got to take into account for the UK coming out. So if we wanted to put that in, just to give perhaps just a proper indication of the numbers. So you're up at 25 versus 21. So there's a $4 trillion difference where there was once 600 billion. Don't feel like we're talking in telephone numbers, but I think he's broadly right to a point there. But America has gone down this pathway of innovation and technology, and I think Europe's been a little bit slow there. But they've never really, to be honest, Jack, it's never really been Europe's go, has it? They haven't had the Apples, they haven't had the Googles, they haven't had the Facebooks.
If you look back to the 80s, the Japanese economy looked like it was going to overtake the American economy in size. And it didn't, and for much the same reason. The Americans are very good at entrepreneurship and innovation. They attract the best and the brightest from all around the world to go there and work and do that because the rewards are enormous if you can pull it off. There is one country in Europe that is an exception to this at the moment, and that's Poland.
Yes, I believe some very good things being done there by a centre-left government.
Yeah, Poland is outperforming even the US in growth at the moment, and for much the same reasons. It's a centre-left government, but it's a relatively low regulation, high innovation, rewarding entrepreneurs sort of government, and it's succeeding.
It seems to be succeeding. You'd also have to look at some of these economic indicators and go, well, look, I know that there was inflation, it was global inflation, and I know it was around about 8% when Biden took over. Apologies for not being specific about that. It's now about 2.1, but overall, the American economy is in pretty rude health. So Trump will enjoy the benefits of an economy basically shaking off its inflationary pressures and moving into significant growth periods.
Yeah, the American economy is not in bad shape, again, with a similar problem to Australia, with an unequal distribution of the benefits and of the costs.
Yeah. Now, we did talk about gas prices, specifically gas prices or energy prices via gas across Europe, and you were citing a figure that had industrial energy in the UK and Germany was the most expensive, and I thought at the time it wasn't quite right. We just wanted to clarify: Ireland, Italy, and Belgium have more expensive electricity. Most countries, including the UK, do not designate a price for industry as opposed to other consumers. Where they base their price, Jack, is they get a price determined by what the most expensive energy source is into the electricity price mix. And Jack, do you want to tell me what it is?
Oh, no idea. Probably
gas.
Nuclear.
Gas.
Gas.
Yeah, it's not nuclear. It's gas. And so. Look, they're not far away. UK and Germany, we went far wrong. We're talking about 40 cents compared to Ireland. I think 47 or 48 cents, and that's per megawatt hour. I forgot the not kilowatt per megawatt hour. Australia is at Around 27, and the price is set by a regulator here. And depending on where you live, it can be between 25 and 45 cents. Those are Australian cents, and there are some concessions available for industry and other rebates. Of course, there's a diesel rebate, Jack, which is a boon, and one must sort of look at government spending. I know they never get rid of it, but it's just thrown away $8 billion every year. I mean, I can certainly understand it, and I see how it's relevant for the farming industry. I'm not so sure about the miners, Jack. But anyway, on a straight currency exchange, our average is around about 30 US cents per megawatt hour. 18 cents in Hong Kong, Jack. A little bit cheaper there too.
Yeah, the historic reason for the diesel rebate is that diesel charge was meant to cover meant to contribute to the cost of the upkeep of the roads, and the diesel rebate is supposedly only available to vehicles that don't use the roads. That is, they're working in mines or working on farms.
Yeah, sounds like a loophole. You could drive one of those enormous mining trucks through, Jack.
Well, they probably don't drive the mining trucks down the street to the 7-Eleven, but some of the farm vehicles may well wander off the farm from time to time.
Look, speaking economics, a very economic heavy here today, Jack. What we're expecting from the Trump administration is an elevation of tariffs across the board by 10%. I think that's the figure that Trump has been quoting. And there will be things like Chinese EVs, for example, which will be absolutely thumped out of the market with tariffs in the 200%, right? How does Australia get on in that kind of environment, and what will there be any benefits for any countries from a trade war?
There might be some short-term benefits in the US. It depends how much is followed through with and how much is a negotiating tool.
Right. But don't we have a free trade agreement with the Americans, Jack?
We do.
So that must be another one of those contracts you could drive the big mining trucks through, because all of a sudden they can just go, oh yeah, no worries, let's just put 10% on everything that comes into the country from the United States, from Australia to the United States.
When you've got the economic power of the United States, you're like the elephant who can stand where he likes.
Yeah, true enough. All right, we're going to see a fair bit more of that over the next, certainly from January 20 onwards.
Quite a bit to play out. The chap who looks like handling this for the incoming government in the US is one of the good appointments. It's the bloke who heads up Cantor Fitzgerald. He's very impressive, I've got to say.
Look, I mean, I certainly understand that the Donald, not quite across how tariffs work. He uses them as sort of a punishment, and he thinks also that it's money into the coffers of the US Treasury. It might be in terms of, let's say, putting 10% on all imports into the US for a brief period, but it will, over time, encourage exporters from around the world to find different markets. Something that, this program might not even go to air. I mean, we're talking about some big news. Joe Biden has allowed the Ukrainians to fire missiles with an extended orbit, that's not right, trajectory, into or across the Russian border. That had been a stumbling point for the provision of US military weapons up until Biden changed his announcement, the lame duck. And on cue, I think the Ukrainians are using UK missiles, and they've fired missiles into Russian territory. And as a result, Putin has threatened a nuclear strike in response, and clearly concerned that there will be a major attack on Kyiv. The US embassy has closed there, and all diplomatic staff have been sent home. very concerning, Jack. Like I say, we can talk about the economy until the cows come home, but if this kicks off, we might be going back to the Stone Age. That's probably a little bit of an overassessment. What we do know is that limited tactical nuclear weapons sitting Russian nuclear weapons are sitting in Belarusian territory, ready to be used. They're essentially a battlefield weapon. But this is getting a bit testy. Can we talk why Joe Biden? Why did Joe Biden change his mind now?
It's a bit of a mystery, isn't it? It's a bit of a mystery, isn't it? There was a further announcement overnight with some other weapons that were being deployed there or being sold to Ukraine as well. And you sort of wonder if this was the right thing to do today, why wasn't it the right thing to do 2 months ago?
I think that's a question that's a reasonable question to ask.
And I don't know the answer to that.
No, I don't. But superficially, at least, it looks like Biden is at least preparing the hospital hand pass for his successor.
Yeah, or perhaps, or the other alternative is that perhaps he thought this was the right thing to do, but he held off because he thought it would be play bad politically. I don't know, but it's a reasonable question to ask, and we probably should be getting an answer.
Yeah. Look, one thing I think I might have mentioned this on the previous program, but there was an interview with Sarah Ferguson on 7:30 with Bob Woodward, and Woodward maintains that the Pentagon was absolutely gung-ho for troops on the ground in Ukraine, and Biden resisted it. He went as far as suggesting that he should win a Nobel Peace Prize over it. So obviously there are still a fair share of hawks in the Pentagon, Jack. I guess goes with the uniform to a very large degree.
Organisations like that generally have a couple of different factions, if not more. Whichever country you're in.
Yeah, right. So we go to the United States now. We've had other nominations. There was a story in Associated Press today, Jack, that the Trump administration in waiting is eschewing the usual background checks. There are actually companies who, and I guess they probably operate in that recruitment type field that do background checks. And one of these company spokesmen said, "Oh, this is a very dangerous thing to do," and I suspect it is a pretty strange thing to do. The education secretary proposed nominate is Linda McMahon. She's currently being sued along with her, I think, ex-husband and the TKO Group Holdings, which owns World Wrestling Entertainment, for their role in creating and allowing a culture of sexual abuse of underage boys. And that will play out in the courts. But what's alleged there is that one of the ring announcers was a pedophile, and they were just basically picking up young kids. And we're talking about 12, 13-year-old boys and girls, I think. So that has got plenty to play. You've got Matt Gaetz there. And now we've got someone's coming forward saying they were a witness to him having sex with an underage woman, a 17-year-old girl. And there's a congressional report too, Jack, that is currently being sat on. And now, so that's Gatesy, who's going to be the Attorney General, most senior lawman in the United States. And just to hold someone's hand, to hold RFK Jr.'s hand, is Dr. Mehmet Oz. And he's an anti-vaxxer from way back, supplement flogger. Going to be interesting, mate.
Yeah. Do you know the last nominee that was actually disallowed because the Senate has a role to play. This is how it's supposed to work. It happens
really, but they do knock them back. Yeah.
It's about, I think there's about 1,000 government executive appointments that are subject to the advise and consent procedure in the Senate. That means they can be knocked out with a Senate vote. The last one to be actually knocked out back by a Senate vote was a senator himself, Senator John Tower from Texas. And that was back in the days of, I think, George Bush the First. And George Bush the First wanted to make him Defence Secretary, and he was knocked back by the Senate, despite being a senator himself. And he was knocked back on the grounds of being a very thirsty chap who did a bit of womanising as well.
Yeah, I can't see Gatesy getting it up. I don't know if you've seen this, Jack. This is from Ben Domenech, who's a Fox News panellist, former blogger at WAPO, a rather controversial hire when he, going back to about 2004 or 5. And this is what he said about Matt Gaetz. I don't know if you've seen this. This is, just put politics aside for a moment, I think this is the biggest spray I've ever, or the best spray I've ever heard. I'll just read it out. I realise that we are occasionally given to hyperbole about the untoward nature of politicians, but let me be clear. Matt Gaetz is a sex-trafficking, drug-addicted piece of shit. He is abhorrent. His eyes are permanently rimmed with the red rings of chemical boosters. In person, he smells like overexposed Axe body spray and stale Astroglide. Oh, that's a nice line. The fact that he boasted on the floor to multiple colleagues in the House of Representatives of his methods of crushing Viagra and high-test Red Bull to maintain his erection through his orgiastic evenings is perhaps the least offensive of his many crimes against womanhood and Christian faith. The man has less principles than your average fentanyl-addicted hobo. He likes them underage, and he's not ashamed about it. Matt Gaetz isn't just your average extreme Florida MAGA man. He's a hypocritical ass with the worst Botox money can buy, pursuing an ever thinner nose and higher cheekbones at every opportunity. Every Republican in Washington has an opinion about Matt Gaetz, and 99% of those opinions are, keep Matt Gaetz away from my wife/daughter/friend and anyone I care about. Oh,
so what do you think? So what do you think his chances are? So what I was saying was that John Tower was the last one to be knocked back. What usually happens is that the nomination is withdrawn.
I don't think that will happen. But I think Matt Gaetz will be rejected. There seem to be enough Republicans who just don't like him for some of those reasons. Perhaps he does smell of stale Astroglide. But as for people like Oz and RFK Jr. and others, they will be in the administration. So I guess the question to you, Jack, is how long do you think that'll last? And that goes for Elon as well, the bromance with the Donald. How long do you think it'll last? Start with RFK Jr. Give me a month next year.
Well, I'd say about a year for most of them.
I reckon you're being pretty generous there. I reckon he'll be gone by June next year. And that's because a lot of the stuff he'll propose, presumably with Oz hand in glove with him, will be bitterly opposed by the farming lobby. Reduction of chemical fertilisers, it's just like, have a look at what happened to Sri Lanka and say, this is your possible future. And he's mad on glyphosate too, which is a commonly used herbicide in farming in the United States. So we're actually talking about what he proposes is in direct that's RFK Jr. What he proposes in direct conflict with high crop yields and good money for farmers. So that's when I think he'll go. I think Gatesy won't get through the process. I think everyone else will. And then I guess the big question is, when do Elon and Donald have a big falling out? How long do you give that? 2 years?
Probably a bit over a year, I think. I think what's likely to happen is that Musk will try and set a pattern, try and set things going the way he thinks they should be going. And if he gets to that point, then he'll say, job done, I'm leaving.
I see the former Australian ambassador to the United States, Arthur Sinodina, sort of be a terrific idea if Elon ran AUKUS.
Yeah.
I think they would just pass that one, just the straight back, and just walk straight past it.
Yeah. The current ambassador has been hard at work beavering up his position.
Yes. How long do you think he'll last? Well, it depends on the next election, doesn't it?
Yeah, I suspect he'll make it work. It's a shame he wasn't down at the G20. He loves those arguing till dawn kind of thing.
He loves a polo or a bit of a dress up for the photos. He loves all that sort of stuff. Does Kevin Rudd? Very quickly, Jack. Nancy Pelosi, she's going again. She made some rather odd remarks. She told the New York Times that Joe Biden should have dropped his re-election bid earlier, and that if he had, Democrats may have had the opportunity to run an open primary. Funny she didn't say that at the time, Jack. But anyway, one of her unnamed senior House Democrat colleagues said she needs to take a seat. And I think that's a pretty good quote. She needs to move on.
I don't think he means a seat in the House.
I think the initials are STFU, Jack. And this is true of the Clintons, to a degree, Barack Obama, certainly Pelosi. Their time has come and gone, and you can certainly Barack Obama was a two-term president, so his input will be sought, but some of these others, they need some fresh blood.
Yeah, well, I think Obama's still got some heft in the party. The Clintons are finished.
Don't want to see them round no more.
No, they've got little influence, little to no, and that's historically inevitable. Your power to influence within the party diminishes the longer it is since you actually held real power, and it's been a long time for them, so they're done. But Obama, I think, still got some influence.
Yeah, I agree with that. Nancy Pelosi's 84, Jack.
Yeah, well, I think she blew it. Really, she was running the show, and she mismanaged it. But the Democrats shouldn't be in despair. In 2008, Obama won more convincingly than Trump did, and had the presidency, the House, and the Senate. And 2 years later, the Republicans won the House back. And that's entirely possible for the Democrats to pull off this time as well.
I agree with you. At 84 years of age, if you're in politics, you should be having a good look at yourself, because basically what these people fear most is not the looming the trumpets of death. It is that they fear, Nancy Pelosi fears relevance deprivation, that she just can't go home, put her feet up and watch the TV. She needs to feel important. And I think it's a sickness, quite frankly. We see it a lot.
Paul Roos, the then Swans coach, in an airport in about 2006 or 7, and Kevin Sheedy walks past with his team. I think I'm not sure whether he'd gone to GWS at this stage, and Roos turned around to his colleagues and said, "If I'm still doing it at that age, shoot me."
Quite right. All right. Now, just a quick bit of a review about the polling. I think Nate Silver said that they got it pretty right. I don't see it at all. I think they're probably about 3 or 4 points shy of Trump's vote again.
So I think that's getting it right. I think the polling was okay once you understood that once again he was likely to outperform the polls by 2 or 3%, and
but
that's kind of what
happened.
happened.
Adjust to these things, Jack, and they said they had, but they hadn't adjusted enough.
Well, but I think the fault lies
Change their methods.
I think the fault lies with the pundits who saw the data and just didn't believe he'd outperform the polls again, and I think that's the malpractice. It's the pundits and the journos and stuff who thought it was going to be level pegging when I couldn't see that. I couldn't see how he wouldn't outperform the polls again.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, that's enough of polling. Look, I'll never take it. US polling seriously again. In India, this is probably just news to you, Jack. Gautam Adani, a billionaire founder of one of India's biggest business conglomerates, was charged by the Justice Department, that's the US Justice Department, with orchestrating a massive bribery scheme to pay off Indian government officials to secure lucrative solar energy supply contracts. Prosecutors announced a 54-page indictment Wednesday that alleges Mr. Adani, the chairman of the Adani Group, personally met with Indian officials to advance the illicit deal and secure contracts that were projected to generate more than $2 billion in profits. If you're wondering, folks, why the US Justice Department is involved in this, prosecutors allege that Mr. Adani, 62, and two executives conspired to misrepresent the company's anti-bribery and corruption practices to US investors and financial institutions to obtain financing. That's where the misconduct is alleged. Also, once you hit the US US financial system, and there'd be no way that the Adani Group could avoid that, you fall under the jurisdiction of the DOJ.
You do.
So we'll see how that pans out, Jack. But that's a fairly significant arrest that's just occurred. Meanwhile, Jack, in the Netherlands, rather disturbing stuff that occurred there over the weekend over a soccer match where the Maccabi Tel Aviv match played the local Jewish football team, Ajax. Another 5 people were arrested overnight, and there have been multiple charges handed out for public violence against persons. There was a very strong strain of anti-Semitism around it, Jack, and very, very ugly indeed. Prime Minister Dick Schoof said earlier on Monday that anti-Semitic attacks against Israelis and Jews were nothing short of shocking and reprehensible. This is in a country where I think 2/3 of the Jewish population was wiped out during the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's been a lot of argument on social media about who caused what. I noticed that Paul Barry was saying that the problem was the Maccabi supporters, and people were jumping in on that. I don't know.
I don't know. No.
Yeah, all I would say is that large parts of Europe have become unsafe for Jews. The mayor of Berlin 2 or 3 days ago made a speech in which she said that Jewish people and gays should avoid certain parts of Berlin, or if they do go there, don't wear anything that identifies them as Jewish or gay, because they would not be safe. And that's a terrible state of affairs.
And it's a terrible state of affairs. I mean, I thought Berlin was one of the great cosmopolitan cities of the world.
I think it had been. It doesn't seem to be anymore.
I read a number of things about the unrest in Amsterdam, Jack, and in fact it was Thursday, not last weekend, as I said. But a lot of the finger pointing has been made to the Moroccan Dutch, and some of the Moroccan Dutch have been living in the country for 2-3 generations.
Yes.
And they don't feel. We're getting onto another area. They don't feel they belong. They're not encouraged by the government. They're not encouraged by corporate, the corporate Netherlands to feel that they belong.
But this is what all of Europe's gotten wrong about multiculturalism and immigration. I mean, it was back in the days when Merkel, David Cameron, and I think it was, I can't remember who was the French president at that stage. I don't think it was Macron. Sarkozy all said that multiculturalism and immigration had failed in Europe. And it has failed because they don't understand what Australia and New Zealand and United States and Canada get right. And that is that you don't just get to become a Canadian or US or Australian citizen. You get to become an Australian or American or a Canadian. And Europe has never culturally worked that out as to how to make these people Dutch, after two. I mean, the Turkish guest workers in Germany are still Turkish guest workers, and they've been there since the 1950s.
Yeah. It's a really good point, and they certainly need to, look. And it's not as if there's any lack of knowledge around this in Europe among government figures. There may not be the political will at the moment, but these are problems that have been basically hemorrhaging for years. And we talk about sort of diminished economic growth and all these sorts of things too, when you've got high rates of unemployment. So if you arrive in somewhere like the Netherlands, you can't find work. You have all sorts of issues around your identity, that there are perceptions around Moroccan Dutch that just aren't the case for Dutch people, whether they're born and bred or have come from another part of the world. So this is a fairly this is a group of people, the Moroccan Dutch, who are struggling with identity. Hell of a lot of crime there too, because Amsterdam is one of the, well, not Amsterdam, but places like Rotterdam are basically the drug trafficking capitals of the world. And my understanding is, and the Dutch have a very, very colourful history in organised crime, that the Moroccan Dutch are largely running that show at the moment. So there are issues there around identity. It's like, you want to come and live in the Netherlands. Here's your visa. Good luck. Off you go. And there's nothing to support it beyond that.
Yeah, but it's a cultural shift that's required. You get off the plane in JFK or in Melbourne or Sydney, that matter. Your taxi driver might be a Bangladeshi who's been there for 6 months, but he'll be an American or an Australian, or the case may be. He'll see himself that way. Yeah. And that's the secret sauce that the Europeans have never recognised exists.
All right, heading to an election at the end of this month, just a few weeks away now, less than 2 weeks away. The Irish are having an election on the 29th of November. That's the Republic, of course. And the history of this is that one of Ireland's two historic centre-right parties, Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, I apologise for my lack of Gaelic instinct there, has led every Irish government for the past century. At the last election in 2020, the two long-standing rivals went into coalition together for the first time, joined by the smaller Green Party. The two core partners agreed to rotate the post of Prime Minister in the Taoiseach, isn't it, Jack? I think it's
the Taoiseach. The Taoiseach, I think. The Taoiseach, I think it is. Gaelic. But every time I pronounce it, someone will write to me and correct me. So I'm confident it will happen again.
If you look at Gaelic and pronounce it the way you think it should sound, you are invariably wrong, and I was wrong. So I do apologise.
Yeah, you probably got to have 4 Guinnesses before you should say it.
I just love this thing about the Irish names. It's beautiful, beautiful names, but they don't appear. It's a non-phonetic. Gaelic is non-phonetic language. So, I guess the question is, Jack, and we'll be able to give you an answer, listeners, after the 29th of November. Are these basically centre-right parties? Are they going to get spanked over economic conditions, particularly cost of living stuff?
No, they're going okay. The big competitor was Sinn Féin, the political arm of the old IRA. But their polling numbers are not quite in free fall, but they're fading away pretty quickly. So I think the last betting I saw was it had Fine Gael at about 8-15 and Fianna Fáil at 15-8. So to get the most seats. So one of those will either form a government or they'll form it in coalition. Ireland's the only place in the EU, I think, that perhaps apart from Poland, that actually has a fiscal surplus at the moment.
Is that right? I thought you were going to say that, well, there have been coalition governments in recent times in Ireland, but I thought you were going to say it was one of the rare European countries not to be in coalition. My understanding is the only one in Europe that there's not a coalition government is Malta, and the rest of them, you've got this very disparate sort of voting behaviour. left, right, minor parties all over the place. Anyway, we will see what happens there, Jack. Are people leaving X, now Twitter? Well, I'm going to tell you, Jack, I signed up to Blue Sky yesterday on the urging of someone, just because I didn't want to didn't want someone else to be Jack the Insider, and then I'd have to be Jack the Insider too, which is always embarrassing. So I did sign up to Blue Sky yesterday, and I am one of 1 million people. Blue Sky is signing are signing up every day. 1 million people in social media terms might sound a lot, but it's really not.
One of the things I saw the other day on the television, CNN were talking about Twitter and the difference between Twitter and X, and the thing that they thought stood out most was that they'd done polling on the political affiliations of United States Twitter users, and when it was Twitter, I think it was 65-35,
right.
Democrat to Republican, and now it is 48-47 Democrat to Republican, so that in their view, and they think that from their own experience that it more closely, Twitter X now more closely resembles the kind of general political makeup of the country.
Well, if you are sick and tired of Elon Musk and X, Blue Sky might be a place for you to have a look. I had a bit of a rummage around there. You can block, if you've got a friend who you might think has similar political views to yours, you can use his block list or her block list, and that means all those people that you don't want to talk to, you'll never have to hear from at all. I reckon in my time on Twitter, and I've been there for 11 years, I reckon I might have blocked maybe half a dozen people. The trouble with blocking people is you don't know what they're going to say after that. And so you want to actually keep them on. You can mute them if they're idiots, and that's probably my go-to measure. What do you do?
I don't bother at all. Do you think Peter Fitzsimons will be able to sell his block list? Because he's very active in being blocked. He managed to shaft your mate Duncan McNabb and myself on the same day a few weeks back.
What was all that about?
Well, I can't remember what Duncan said, but I know what I said. Peter Fitz was berating someone who disagreed with him, and as usual, sort of criticising their grammar.
A bit of the old class-based condescension,
and which coming from Peter Fitz is terrific because his writing sprinkled randomly with commas. I mean,
they're typos, Jack. They don't have subs anymore. It's not his fault.
And I just asked whether there was ever a time when he perhaps got a little bit tired of talking down to people.
You have no shortage of energy for that, mate.
Yeah, and
blocked.
Duncan and I were laughing that we were both sent back to the sheds, at the same time.
Both blocked.
Yeah, both blocked the same day.
Yeah. Oh well, Fitz hasn't blocked me yet that I know of, but we'll find out about that. I think the one that always got me, and it sort of bemused me rather than I didn't get cross about it, but Mike Carlton blocked me, and I never said a word to the guy on Twitter. He just looked at me and goes, Australian News Corp. It's a bloke who's fed off the media his entire life until he became, shall we say, difficult, a difficult character to deal with. All right, over to sport.
Mike Carlton was a very fine radio broadcaster, I've got to say.
I think, I'm sure I didn't meet him. He was good mates with Bill Leake there for a very long time. Very good mates, and that didn't last. All right, over to sport. Very, very important stuff. Tomorrow, as we record this, Australia will play India in the first test in Perth. And it is the contest of the two best test-playing nations. The television audiences will be counted in the billions. Who starts as favourite, Jack?
Well, I think Australia does. One, they're at home, and two, India's coming off a 3-0 loss in India to New Zealand. So their form's not great. In particular, Rowett's not going to play the first test, at least he's become a father again. But Rowett and Coley, I think two of their really important players, have both been pretty out of form. I think Coley's averaging 30 over the last couple of years. So
he's been getting out to spin. He's been getting out to slow bowling. Now, you're playing a lot of his cricket in the subcontinent. He's going to be facing a lot of slow bowling, but at the same time, the figures are pretty difficult to argue with. I think of his last, let's say, 40 dismissals, I think something like 36 have been to slow bowling.
Yeah, Ricky Ponting made the good point the other day that
he got a blast from Gautam Adani, the Indian coach. But go on.
He did, because the first half of what he said was that yes, he's out of form, and he thought that Coley would probably agree he was out of form as well. But Ricky went on to say that his record in Australia is very, very good, and if there was a tour on which he was going to bounce back, it'd probably be this one.
Got a ton in Perth that doesn't have a steeped history, does the Optus Stadium in Perth, but he's one who's already got 100 there. So, look, the other thing that might actually fall in the advance, you might remember the last Indian tour of Australia were beaten. And Australia were well up at the start of the series, and in fact, I think knocked over India for 36. Was that at Bellerive? I can't remember. But anyway, they were knocked over for 36 with Hazelwood doing the damage. And then I think Coley had to leave for parental leave. And there were a number of other injuries to senior players, and all of a sudden these young guys came through who are excellent cricketers, just haven't had an opportunity, and they won the series basically with a lot of inexperienced players. The rise of Rishabh Pant at the time, he got a magnificent ton, I think in Sydney, didn't he? A real
and another 80 or something in Brisbane or something
Such a good player. He's such a good player, and it's great to see him back. I think if Sharma may well miss 2 tests, he may just miss the Perth test, but I think any opportunity to play the young guys must be really hard to break into that test side. But if you're given that opportunity, I think some of these guys are going to seize that opportunity to become stars of the future.
Well, given the numbers they've got, it's a bit like a bit like the rugby. The really big countries like England and and India in cricket, their second, third, and fourth teams are pretty damn good.
Well, I maintain that if Western Australia put together a test side, they'd make a mess of most test sides around the world. Look. We've obviously got a new opener. Nathan McSweeney will open the batting with Usman Khawaja. Khawaja turns 38, Jack, I think, very soon. And so I think we might have a completely new opening partnership perhaps by the end of this series.
By the Ashes next year, you mean?
Yeah, I would think so. And that might give way to... Marcus Harris is in runs at the moment, but overlooked. The other one, Peter Hanscom, Jack. Apparently, he's made more 50s in the last 12 months than any other cricketer around the world. I mean, at that level, at the elite level or first class level.
I always thought he was pretty good. He didn't seem to get enough of a run at it to me.
He had some. He's got some sort of odd technical things, I think, and he got found out. He made some adjustments and it didn't quite pan out to his batting. I noticed Shane Watson, Jack, he was interviewed about what he thought, what was going to happen in the series. He said Steve Smith looks absolutely golden at the moment, and I have to say, for a little bit I've seen of him, he just seems to be in really, really good nick. So got the new opener, Usman. Usman, of course, he's a guy who'll occupy the crease, and I think McSweeney will do the same. Then we've got Marnus, who needs runs, and then we've got Smith, and then we've got Head and Mitch Marsh. So there's some ways of increasing your scoring rate if those two get going. And the bowling attack, which we've been watching for the last 5 years, pretty much uninterrupted. Stark, Hazelwood, Cummins, and Lyon. You don't really need a fifth bowler. I mean, I think Mitch Marsh might, but he's not huge about it. And of course, Travis Head, probably not at Perth, but Travis Head and the Eastern States might get to roll the arm over a bit. But I like this. I like the Australian side. I think they'll go pretty well. But it'll come down to Marnus and Smith to a very large degree. If they have good summers, then Australia will win the series. All right. Now, out of the blue, this is, Jack. Well, we mentioned it last week. The Wallabies beating England at Twickenham. Wonderful game of rugby. Just a fantastic ending. You know, when international rugby is played, you know, a good game of international rugby is played. By gee, it's a good sport to watch.
Mind you, a bad game of rugby is an awful thing to watch.
Oh yeah, someone took me. It was my first test, Australia v France. No tries. I think it was like 6-10 or something. It was just awful. Because you know, if you watch a lot of Australian rules footy, you want to see pass and run. You know, you want to see lines get broken and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, they've had a magnificent win again against Wales, and the coach and the playing group, they look like they're just having a ball at the moment.
Yeah, Wales are terrible, it must be said.
But it was a comprehensive beating. It was the sort of comprehensive walloping you would expect.
Yeah, but the Wallabies are playing really good rugby. As always, the Wallabies are throwing it around and scoring tries and all that sort of stuff. But this time, for the first time for a long time, it looks to me like it's built off a solid foundation. You know, that is that the set pieces are good. The run and carry from the inside players, from the forwards, and that is really good.
Their big forwards are running with the footy.
Yeah, and running well. So it's all very well to be expansive on the outside, but you need to have a solid base for it to be successful. And they look like they're building to that. But to be frank, I think they're still probably a level below the top four, which is, you know, Ireland,
of
France.
Course, the All Blacks made a meal of the Irish.
Yeah, that was a pretty low standard game for both of them. I think the Irish were terrible more than the All Blacks were good.
They're missing a few too, Ireland, weren't they?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Look, we'll see. But look, it's just great.
I'm just loving.
We want to see rugby healthy in this country. We want to see union healthy in this country.
Yeah, and the answer to that is they'll get a lot of money out of the Lions Tour and the World Cup. This time, don't piss it up against the wall. And I'm loving the way that you're now embracing the All Blacks as your own, seeing as how the magic internet formula tipped you over as a New Zealander.
Yeah, I'll be there. I'll be there in a couple of weeks, Jack. Look, you want to take us out? There was a rather wonderful photo. And it was an airport one, but it was a private jet with the Donald Jr., Elon, and RFK Jr., and they were tucking into a bit of lunch, Jack.
They were, and RFK Jr., of course, is quite opposed to the idea of having a Big Mac.
Looked like a cow eating prickles, didn't he?
He did, and there was a lot of fun to be had on X after this. But the one that was best compared it to a drug gang taking a suspected undercover cop,
chopping him up a line or two and see how he went for it,
and telling him, "We have a little test here. You got to hop into this line, otherwise we think you're an undercover."
I don't know if he passed it or not. He hadn't unwrapped his burger, and of course they've got him a little bottle of Coke as well, the full strength Coke, and. Kennedy, of course, famously said that he used to drink about 10 or 12 full-strength Cokes. This is probably while he was a heroin addict. But he hasn't drunk it for a long time. And he had made previous comments about this. I don't know if you saw these. It's disgusting, the food they serve on Air Force One when Trump was president first time around. He said there's the menu choice is like, would you like a Big Mac or a bucket of chicken, bucket of KFC?
or a cheeseburger.
Yeah, I honestly don't think that's going to last, Jack. The RFK one, Elon looked to be happy chowing down on a burger. And
firstly, I don't think all of these nominations will get through. There'll be a lot of withdrawals. Would be my guess.
Yeah. You think Gates will withdraw?
That's what usually
Gates
happens.
is not your withdrawing type.
No, he might not. He might be the first since.
I think he'll be the one.
First since John Tower to get knocked back, and remarkably for quite similar reasons.
Less of the alcohol, but more of the intimate shenanigans, Jack. Yes, all right. Well, that takes us out. Here we are at the end of the show. Look, I did receive some comments from Reuters. In fact, one that just listened to our last episode. We'll get to that next week. Apologies, listeners, but we'll get to our Reuters comments next week. And we look forward to them always. So please drop me a line on Twitter. You can also get me on Blue Sky if you like. Same handle at Jack the Insider, and Jack. And you can get hold of Jack on his Substack.
HongKongJack.substack.com.
I'll remember that one day. All right. Okay. You guys go well, and we will see you next week. All the best. See ya.